to record this today.
Absolutely. Okay,
And
so everyone should be able to see my title slide. Awesome. So I'm Lynn Hoffman. I'm currently the Director of Operations at the Somerset County Library System of New Jersey. We're a county library system in central New Jersey. It's the pretty part of New Jersey. It's very green right now. It's quite lovely. Some of you may know me from having worked at the Naperville Public Library previous to this job, and so I'm really delighted to be able to connect back up virtually with my Rails and Illinois library friends. So the topic that we're going to talk about this afternoon is communication strategies for managing change. And when Louise asked if there were any topics that I might like to give a webinar on, that came kind of right in the middle of some changes that were going on here at my library. And it occurred to me that this is something that many of us, I think, run into from time to time. Whether it's something that you actually have planned for in a specific way or whether you get thrown into it, there's always opportunities to improve the way we communicate change. So we're going to start off actually with two poll questions. So we'll go right to the first one if we could, Louise.
Sure, I'm going to launch the first one now. So the first one is, are you in the middle of a change right now that you're trying to manage?
So is there something right now that this particular webinar could be helpful to you with? So just take a few seconds for a yes or no.
Yep. We'll take a few more seconds. About 70% have voted. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and show the results. And so, Lynn, I'm not sure if you can see that, but 84% of the people said yes, they are in the middle of a change.
Okay, so hopefully this will be practical and usable stuff that you can take away with you today. We're going to go right to the second poll question, which is how confident are you in your ability to communicate well about change? And there's a scale from not confident at all, I need help, to extremely confident, I should totally be doing this webinar. So go ahead and give me an idea of where you fall on that spectrum.
Okay, about 50% have voted, so I'll give it a few more seconds. All right, a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share those results. So about 3% said not confident at all, they need some help.
Okay.
19% say they're somewhat unconfident, they muddle through. The majority voted, 65% said they are somewhat confident, they feel they communicate pretty well. And 14% said they are rather confident, they're a good communicator. And no one said extremely confident.
Okay, so I don't feel so bad then that I'm the one who's doing this webinar. I will say that developing confidence in your ability to communicate well about change really, like anything else, comes through practice. And the fact that a lot of you feel like you're kind of right in the middle, that you communicate pretty well, doesn't surprise me in the slightest. And in fact, your instincts about communication through change are probably right on the money. It's just a question of thinking kind of intentionally about how you manage change and how you communicate with folks about change. So before we get to specific communication strategies, which will be kind of the latter part of the presentation, let's first talk about what those strategies are going to need to address. And it is this. I love this statue, this poor fearful gentleman. Managing change isn't about change, it's about emotion. Let that sink in for a sec. Again, this is something that may be instinctive to you, but it really is true. Change management is not just about the details, although those are very important, and getting all your ducks in a row and knowing kind of where you are and where your benchmarks are and who your stakeholders are. That's all really important stuff. But in the grand scheme of things, that's actually the easier part. The more difficult part is handling people's emotional reactions to change, which is what you really have to deal with before you can effectively move on to the details. And why is this? It comes down to the brain. So if you know me, you know that I have a thing about neurology, and I'm kind of a wannabe neuropsych person. Will read anything I can get my hands on about brain science. So one of the things that I find fascinating and that I know happens to me is that my brain doesn't always help me out in the way I want it to when I'm facing changes. So the limbic system of the brain, which is kind of like your alarm system, it's where your amygdala is, which is kind of the fear flag. It takes in all of the incoming stimuli around you to decide whether or not it's threatening. This is the part of the brain that does the fight or flight thing. And when it kicks in the rest of that whole limbic system to handle a threat, it uses a lot of energy, actual energy in the form of carbohydrate, which doesn't leave a lot for the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that does more with intellectual functions, critical thinking, executive decision making. It doesn't leave much energy for that part of the brain to do its job. In Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman, if you've read that before, he talks about the amygdala hijack, and I think that's a really apt sort of metaphor for it, that when your amygdala is processing a threat, it just takes over all of the available energy that your brain has to spend on decision making. So in other words, when you're experiencing some kind of a threat, it means there isn't much left in the tank for anything else. What's fascinating is that the brain treats social and emotional threats and rewards with the same intensity that it does physical threats and rewards. And that's why a lot of our metaphors about how we feel are located in our body. Our brain processes them in almost exactly the same way. The same parts of your brain light up when you are threatened emotionally as do when you're threatened physically. The other key is that your brain becomes more aroused or uses more energy in proportion to the strength of that response. And arousal in the face of danger or threat comes on faster and with much more intensity than a potential reward. So we're kind of fighting an uphill battle when it comes to handling those emotions and how they manifest themselves in the way people interact with each other. Fortunately, there is a tremendous model. This is one of my favorite articles about how to use neuroscience in our workplace and with our coworkers. The link is there at the bottom of the slide. It's also in the handout, the overview handout that I have listed. It's called SCARF, which is a brain-based model for collaborating with and influencing others. And the whole idea behind this article is that if you can predict where the trouble spots are going to be or what things people care about, that you can lay some groundwork to help get people past that initial emotional response and move on to actually doing some analysis and processing. So it covers 5 things, helpfully acronymed SCARF, and I just want to touch on each of them briefly. They're pretty self-explanatory, but just to kind of flesh them out a little bit more. The first one is status, which is often kind of put in terms of rank or expertise or experience. So if status is something that's important to you, when your status is threatened, you're going to feel that immediate reaction, that emotional response. You're going to, if status is important to you, you're going to seek ways to reward using that status. Certainty, it's exactly what it sounds like, predictability. Your brain really likes patterns, and so when it can't predict what's going to come next, that's troubling to the brain. That's where you get your amygdala engaged. Autonomy, think about this in terms of agency and control. Can I make decisions about what I get to do or where I get to be? Relatedness, that's the social piece of things, that if relatedness is important to you, then you want to feel like you belong and that you're accepted, and if you're not feeling that, that can be threatening. And finally, fairness. Justice, transparency often figures into fairness as well, so that you can see exactly how decisions are made. And if you can't see that, that kind of threatens how you feel about fairness. So here's how this works. You've got your brain. You've got these 5 domains. And as your brain tries to kind of get some good emotions going, it's going to seek rewards in these areas depending on what's important to you. Much more overwhelmingly, though, it's also going to avoid threats to those things. Oh, it looks like my slide bumped off there. Pardon me for that. Fairness is missing at the bottom. We had some line wrap issues there. So seeking rewards for those things is all well and good, but avoiding threat is going to override that every single time. Every time. So most of us have one domain that's easier to trigger than the other domains. That isn't to say that there isn't a particular change that might not prompt a threat response in a domain where you're usually okay, but there's usually one that's particularly sensitive. So I want to go to the third poll, and as you think about changes that you've encountered, think about your own reactions and which domain would you say is usually your trigger when it comes to change. So if we could get that poll, Louise.
Sure, I'm going to launch that now. You should be able to vote. Everyone's being real quick with the clicks today. All right, we're at 50%. Give it a few more seconds. All right. 3 more seconds here. Yeah, we're at 80%, so I'm going to go ahead and close it and show the results. Okay, so 14% chose status, 30% certainty, 19% autonomy, only 3% relatedness, and then 35% fairness. So the top
Awesome.
2 were fairness and certainty, but not a strict majority.
Gotcha. Excellent. So thanks for that feedback. I'm guessing that it was probably relatively easy for you to think about which area it was that is your kind of domain trigger. Just a couple of observations. One is that, again, this is not like one to the exclusion of everything else, but there's one area usually where people are more sensitive than they are in others. The other thing that's really interesting is, so as a culture in libraries, we kind of have the fairness thing baked into our DNA, particularly in my experience in public libraries, because that's kind of what we do. We try to be fair to everybody, and so we tend to automatically predict where those trouble spots are going to show up without really even thinking about it, which means that in our kind of change initiatives, that's usually not the place where we run into trouble, where someone feels threatened on the fairness domain and they have a reaction to that. On the flip side, status, for instance, is one of the lower ones for us here in library land. And that makes sense. I mean, we're not corporate ladder climbers for the most part. And you can probably think of someone who you work with or have worked with, though, in whom a perceived threat to their status took you by surprise, that something went kind of haywire because maybe you challenged their expertise or you didn't kind of honor their experience, and that may have kind of crept up on you, and the reason is because we're not automatically tuned into status the way that we are to fairness. It doesn't surprise me at all that certainty is one of the things. I think that that's a pretty natural human instinct, is again to like that predictability. So yeah, so we're going to get to what this means and how you can actually use this to your advantage when thinking about communication. I do want to just ask if anybody has any comments about how this domain stuff and how the SCARF model might have played out in a recent change. I don't know if we can maybe, if you can type them in the chat box real quick, maybe take 30 seconds or so, and maybe Louise, you could share a couple with the audience?
Sure, I'll keep an eye out. Let's see what folks type in. We might have to give this a few seconds as
Yeah, no
they
problem.
type.
While we're waiting, I can share with you that my trigger tends to be autonomy. That, you know, I'm an independent person, and I like to have choices and options, and when someone tells me that they're going to make those decisions for me, it gets my hackles up. So that's one area where I'm particularly sensitive, and I tend to try to find ways to give people options and to make choices about things.
Yeah, as we're waiting, I'll share. I think for me, it's certainty. You know, I kind of like to know when what's going on, and when there's that unknown, you know, that stresses me out. So.
Yes, clearly you are not alone.
Yeah. So I haven't seen any comments come in, so I don't know if you would like to move on and then circle back later if anything comes in.
Sure, that's fine. And I would say,
Okay.
too, if you have any questions about this whole model, please do feel free to shoot those into the chat as well. The article that will be linked is pretty awesome. David Rock, the author, also has a great book called Your Brain at Work that really looks at a lot of how the neuroscience works and how you can play that to your advantage, not just in terms of change and decision making, but all kinds of other areas as well. So I think that's a great one. So that's kind of the foundation for the rest of what we're going to talk about today. The notion that change is really first and foremost about emotion and people's reactions to that emotion before you get into the nuts and bolts details of what that change actually is going to entail. So we'll move on. Questions so far? We got that? Okay. There are a number of great models out there in the world for managing change. I've got a couple favorites I want to share with you. One of them is William Bridges' Managing Transitions. And this particular model really taps into this idea that you have to deal with people's emotional reactions and make that part of the communication process if your change initiative is going to be successful. Bridges' model kind of looks at there are three processes that people have to work through as part of any change. The first part is ending or losing or letting go of whatever you're changing from, and acknowledging that that is a painful process for a lot of people, and that can take some time to do and let go of. He's got some great strategies for dealing with that. The last process is the new beginning part, and that's where you kind of learn new processes and procedures and new skills, and you become competent with whatever that change has to do with. In the middle is the neutral zone, also known as the messy middle. And that's the part when you've already let go of what's familiar and comfortable, but before you feel like you're competent and that you understand what's happening with the new changes, it can be ugly. And that's the part where William Bridges really talks about communication being key. He suggests putting together a transition monitoring team for a large transition so that it isn't just one person who's doing that communicating, and there isn't just one person who's hearing feedback about what people's concerns and issues are. It's a great book. It's a relatively slim read. I highly recommend it. The other model that I wanted to share is John Kotter, Leading Change. This is actually an updated edition. The original, I think, was published in 1995. This one, I think, was in 2012. His model for change really is about the leadership piece of it. So his 8 items are creating urgency. So talking about why a change might be necessary and convincing people that the time for that change is now. Forming a powerful coalition, finding the official and unofficial influencers in your organization, creating a vision for change, and then communicating the vision. Communicate part being very important there. Removing obstacles, and this is where he kind of loops in the emotion piece of things. Creating short-term wins, which helps people to feel successful, which is obviously beneficial. Building in the change and then anchoring it into the culture. So this is the Leading Change is kind of a seminal baseline sort of book about change management. There are lots of other models out there. And you'll find them in books and all over the internet. Some of them are better than others. What's common among them is that they usually lay out a process that starts with, okay, so here's this change that we want to make, and so we're going to plan for it, and we're going to prepare for it, and we're going to lay out our plan for communicating with people about it, and we're going to follow that plan through over a period of time, and we're going to gather feedback. What we know, though, is that it doesn't always work like that, and certainly it hasn't always worked like that for me, which can make it hard to use a really well fleshed out change management model because there's no entry point at the middle. It starts at the beginning and it's hard to know how to kind of dive into it at the midpoint. So what happens when you can't plan it out from the start? There are three scenarios that I would propose as being possible reasons that this might happen. The first one is the fast track. So you get handed a change initiative by a supervisor or an administrator, and you rightly say, well, we're going to need to take some time to plan out our change strategy and come up with our plan for communication and management. And that person says, well, that's all really nice, but I need this to be done in 30 days. So the expectation in that case is that you're going to skip the change management, and what do you do with that? On a diving scale, I would call this degree of difficulty a 1.8. It's pretty tough, but you know at least kind of the people involved and who you're dealing with, and you kind of have an idea of where your trouble spots might be. A second scenario might be if you are picking up a change midstream as part of a new role. So you're changing hats. I think this one's a little tougher. I've called it a 2.4 on the degree of difficulty scale. The difficulty here is that someone else may or may not have done that planning already. And so by the time you step into it, what you have in front of you may be a really workable plan for how to communicate with folks about change, or it may not be a plan at all. You may be out of luck there. But again, at least if you're in the same organization, you probably have some idea about what that change is. You may be aware of it. You know who the personalities are. You have some thoughts about what that, what the pitfalls might be. The third scenario is the one that I found myself in most recently, and that is being new in town, where not only are you changing into a new role, but you're also moving into a new organization. So all of the things that you took for granted or could assume about how things worked and what strategies might work best, you kind of have to throw out the window and start over. And learn brand new at a new organization. And it's so easy to assume that what one library does is exactly the same as another library. And if you've had this experience, you know that that is not the case. And I still find myself in situations where I think I know what's going on, and then I ask a question and realize, oh wait, I have no idea what's going on at all. I would call this a 4.1. This is really tough. I would say in any of these kinds of scenarios, though, you can apply some of the same kinds of strategies. And the first one kind of goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. So the first one is to get down to the basics and to answer the question, who is concerned about what? As we've discussed, it doesn't matter if those concerns are irrational or if they aren't based in fact. The fact that they're concerns means that there's emotion behind them, and you have to address that before you can deal with the nuts and bolts of what's actually going to be happening. One of the handouts that's posted, I should have flipped the title and subtitle, has anticipating concerns as part of the title. It has a table on it that looks kind of like this with some other information on it. So this is one way that you can try to anticipate what people's concerns are going to be based on the SCARF model, which I've found to be a really useful way to organize my thinking about people who might have concerns that are different than mine. The idea is that for whatever change it is that you're managing, that you would kind of brainstorm what the potential threats might be to someone who is sensitive about that particular domain, and then document who might be affected in that way, who might have a negative emotional reaction as a result of that feeling threatened. So I want to just walk through a couple of quick examples so that you've got an idea of kind of what we're talking about. And I'm just going to go through them verbally. This is something that you can do with your own change that you're in the middle of, that many of us are in the middle of right now. So the first one I'll just throw out there is, let's say we're rearranging a workroom. So on the status, what things might be threatening if someone cares a lot about status about rearranging a workspace. So it might be something like not having a window, if that person feels like having a window signifies that they've achieved some kind of status in your organization, or not having their own office anymore, or not having the best office or the best desk or whatever that is. Whatever their perception is about the physical space that really signifies their status in the organization, that the fact that that may be changing may be threatening, and that could be the thing that kind of occupies that person's entire brain. And until you kind of acknowledge that and deal with that, it's hard to move beyond it to the nuts and bolts of actually moving that office around. Certainty. Maybe the fear is that you don't know what your workstation is going to be like, or if it'll even work for your job, and you like to have things set up a certain way and you don't know yet what that's going to look like. Certainty is a tough one because a lot of times when we're in the midst of change, we don't have the answers to everything. And so addressing that can be a difficult thing to do to the satisfaction of the person for whom that's really their sensitive spot. And we'll get to that a little bit later. Autonomy. If I don't have any input into how things get rearranged and don't have any choices about how my workspace is going to set up, that's going to trigger a threat response from me. Relatedness. If it's important to me to be close to my people and to have my friends around me, if I'm going to be physically separated from them, that can be potentially threatening if relatedness is important to me. And then fairness. If I have to give something up that I perceive to be valuable, but someone else gains, then there's an inherent imbalance there, and that's going to be perceived as a threat. You may, as you're thinking about this particular scenario or whatever change scenario you're handling in your own organization, know who the people are who have kind of a sensitivity in each of these domains. I know that there are staff here at my library who I know absolutely status is this person's deal, or relatedness is what this person cares about. And if I don't find a way to address that, that's going to just override that person's ability to handle the change that's coming down the pike. So that's kind of what you would go ahead and do. Itemizing the potential pitfalls, or to anticipate what those potential concerns might be. Make sure that you're not caught flat-footed when that concern comes back to you. And going through this exercise is helpful, especially in the areas where you're not as sensitive. So it's important for me to understand what status concerns people might have, because that's something that I don't really care that much about. So it wouldn't be on my radar unless I thought intentionally about it. I'll just run through another one real quick. So maybe we're reassigning staff and reassigning work functions. Someone might be threatened by not being the expert anymore, or feeling like they've been downgraded somehow in terms of status. Uncertainty, a person might feel extremely competent in their work and being able to do the tasks that are assigned to them and not knowing whether they'll be able to achieve that same level of competence can be extremely disconcerting. Autonomy, maybe the change affects the workflow, and not having the ability to work to kind of divide up a person's time on their own or figure out in which order to do things. That can be really threatening. Losing work peers if relatedness is your deal, or fairness. Again, having to give something up when somebody else gains. If the perception is that that's not fair, that can be a really tough emotional thing to overcome. So that's the first step, is to itemize what those potential issues are. Who's concerned about what? I'm going to take just a quick moment to see if anybody has any questions about how that kind of fits together. And we'll get to the what do you do with that information momentarily.
Sure. Lynn, we didn't have any questions, but one participant, going through your exercise just now, made a comment that they're thinking about adding a self-checkout station. And, so she can see the potential problems that might create with workflow and things like that. So
absolutely.
That's another example of a big change that could use that chart to go through.
That's a great example. And you could apply the same kind of exercise to not just staff but the public. I mean, so the things that I've kind of brought up are internal changes, but again, thinking about the public and how they might perceive a big change, that's going to be really important as well. That's a great example.
And then one other comment, another person said that, even if they use this example with scarf, that sometimes there's concerns that come up that she may not have even thought of. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, actually, we're going to get to that, and if I don't answer it completely, then let us know, and I can address it again as we get on toward the end of the presentation.
Sounds good. That's it for now.
Excellent. All right, so we know, or we have an idea about who's concerned about what. We've tried to kind of pare down to the basics of those emotional threats that people might perceive in whatever change is kind of coming down the pike. So the next thing is planning what to communicate and when. Again, this is one of those steps that's in the change management models and that you would kind of roll out and put together right from the beginning, but it isn't something that you have to do from the beginning. Even if you come in midstream or you're kind of midstream on a change and you realize, I need to kind of take a different approach to this, you can still come up with this plan. I will say there is no such thing as too much communication. So planning it out, figuring out a way to communicate in regular intervals so that people hear from you a lot, and then stepping up those intervals as you get into the home stretch of whatever that change might be is really helpful. I've got an example here. This actually is the real-life change that I stepped into when I started my job here at Somerset County. My library has migrated to Google for Work for our email and productivity, and so we knew that it was going to happen, and over the weekend of October 3rd, migration of our data was going to happen, and I had 2 months to figure out how we're going to manage that. So one of the first things that I did was to print out a calendar and jot down my schedule for emails that would go out to all staff members. I decided that it would be important for people to hear from me once a week, and that those emails could be on the short side, depending on what I had to talk about, but that weekly contact would be important. I also kind of fleshed out some ideas about what the topic of those emails might be. That changed as we went through the project, but this was kind of a starting point to make sure that I hit all the high points. And again, one of the things that I wanted to try to do was to look at those predictions about what people's concerns were going to be. So for someone who has a certainty trigger, not knowing whether all of their email was going to come over correctly would be really, really challenging to deal with, for instance. Or for someone like me who likes autonomy, knowing whether all of my filters and settings and special customizations, if I would be able to do those same things in the new email system, that was really important to me. So each email tried to touch on some of those concerns. They were all set up so that they had the same basic subject line, so Google Update and then whatever the subject was, so that people began to understand that when you see this Google Update email, this is what it's going to have. So in this case, this is the one about training plans, and this is my attempt to sort of address all of the different ways that people like to learn, and to reassure people early on that yes, there will be lots of training and lots of different ways to get training, so it'll all be okay and everything will be fine. So we kind of tried to go through every mode we can think of: hands-on classes, using the documentation online, diving in and playing around, all that kind of good stuff. All of the emails that got sent out followed pretty much the same template. So setting up that schedule, figure out what you're going to communicate and when. It's really never too late in the process to go ahead and do that. Next, how many different modes of communication can you use? I will say again, there is no such thing as too much communication. And it's a great idea to try to disperse your message and your communication across as many communication platforms as you can. Email obviously is a really convenient form. You can write it once and everybody sees the same thing, especially among our professional administrative staff. They're in email all the time, so they're going to see it when it comes up. But that isn't the only way we needed to communicate. So we did actually have folks, supervisors, print out some of those emails and stick them in people's boxes in cases that they knew that they didn't really have a chance to read email very often. We also tried to make a lot of time to talk to people in person and listen to their concerns. That face-to-face contact, I mean, there's the old saw about how 70% of communication is nonverbal, and whether or not that's actually the case, having that FaceTime, I think, is really important and makes people feel even more like they're being heard, and that their concerns are being acknowledged than just shooting it by email. And I'll touch on that in a little bit as well. I will say, again, speaking personally, my bias is always toward text. Like, my brain is wired for print. I am happy to read a lengthy email. I'm an instruction manual reader, so email is an awesome way to communicate for me. And if you give me a video overview of something, I'm going to tear my hair out because I really just want the transcript so I can read it. Other people might feel differently about that, as I'm sure all of you know. And so by providing communication, and the same communication in many cases, in multiple modes, you're not assuming that everyone's going to use all of them. You can assume that people will just kind of gloss over whatever communication modes aren't meaningful to them. So that means if I'm not an email girl, if I put something really, really important in email, I need to make sure that I follow up on that in some other mode, whether that's asking the supervisor to touch base with them in person, or me touching base in person, or sending them something physically, or giving them a video, or, I mean, whatever. If there's something really important, one communication mode isn't going to do the trick. There are some great tools for producing video, especially video of just webcasty type stuff. Screencast-O-Matic is one of my favorite ones, and it's a quick and easy way to be kind of a talking head and to show some visuals on the screen, like in a Google Slides or PowerPoint presentation at the same time. So you can address your visual learners that way. It's also great for quick and dirty screencasts about how to do X on a PC. Lots of other stuff out there. I would refer you to your, I'm sure, large collections regarding communication about how to actually attack some of those other modes. Just wanted to make sure to make that point, though, that multiple modes really are very important indeed. The next item is really to create tiered levels of detail. I will say again, there is no such thing as too much communication. And there's nothing wrong with giving people more information than they need. It's better to provide more information than less, and if you kind of give it to folks in chunks, then you've oriented people to what the really key things are and what the fine print is if they're interested in reading that. So I have an example I'm going to go through, but before I do, I'll say a couple of things. One is in the absence of providing information or detail, based on whatever the fear is that a person has, their brain will automatically try to fill in the blanks. And filling in those blanks may not be with accurate or useful information. So anytime you can pre-fill those blanks, you're giving yourself a leg up. The other thing is, just like with modes of communication, assume that people will gloss over any degree of detail that isn't of interest to them, but provide it so that they can make that decision for themselves. So here's an example. This is my we're going to move the workroom around example. So let's say this is an email as kind of the first line, or maybe not the first line, maybe we've talked about this in a staff meeting, or there's been some other communication about it, but this is kind of the email that lays it all out. So the first thing is to say, here's what's going to happen. Now that we've finished making staffing changes, we're going to rearrange the workroom later this month. And then why? More explanation below. That's important. We'll get there. What does that mean for you? And I like to use that phrase specifically because that's the key question that people are going to have. So this thing is changing. Why do I need to care about it? Or what about it is going to hit that trigger point for me? So in this case, your workspace will be changing leading up to the holiday weekend. We'll give you boxes, blah, 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 blah. Now we're going to address a possible concern. So is my space going to work for me? How's it going to work? So after the move, your workspace may not be laid out in exactly the same way as it is now, but we will definitely make sure that you have the right kind of space for the duties that are part of your job. So again, trying to fill in the blanks and address a possible concern that we've identified already. Watch for a diagram of the new space to come later today, filling in the certainty gap. Super important. Questions, concerns, let me know. I probably close almost every email that I send to all staff with that exact line. You can never repeat too often that you're open to feedback and concerns. And then here's the more detailed explanation. So if a person really doesn't care about the details, they don't have to read this, and they won't. They'll just skip it. But for a lot of our staff and our coworkers, having the why helps fill in the blanks better about some of those concerns that they might have. So why are we arranging things? Our work has changed, but our workroom is still set up the way it was. We've changed our staffing so we've got the right people in positions, and now instead of trying to shoehorn what we do into the existing space, we want to rethink the workroom so that it works for us. So that kind of lays out the urgency for this change, or the vision for why this is important. Chunking things out like that lets people consume whatever amount of information is going to satisfy their need. Don't be afraid to provide a lot of detail. Just make sure that you've packaged it in a way that allows people to pick and choose the things that they want. Headers, single sentence paragraphs, bullet points, asterisks, and footnote-y kinds of things. Actually, they're all really useful tools that you have to kind of give people those choices about the level of detail that's important to them. Next. Communicate directly. Don't rely on trickle-down. Depending on your organizational culture, you may already have in place really good sort of all staff or all customer communication channels. In some places where I've worked, that hasn't been the case, and the expectation has been that as an administrator, if I need to communicate something to frontline staff, that I should push that down through supervisors and managers until it gets to that frontline staff. And in some cases that works fine, but you can't rely on that happening all the time. Part of the issue is that each supervisor or manager may make a decision about whether or not your communication applies to the people that they supervise. And really you want to let individuals have that decision-making power themselves. So by communicating directly with stakeholders, you're letting the individuals, not you, not that person's supervisor, decide for themselves whether or not your communication applies to them. They can ignore it if it doesn't, but if it does, they've got it direct from the horse's mouth. In organizations where that hierarchy is important, the way kind of around that I've often used successfully is to shoot out kind of a preview to the supervisors or managers involved. So to say, you know, I'm going to be sending out an email on Thursday about this new change. Here's what it's going to say, just so that you've got a heads up, and if anybody asks you about it, you already know what the deal is. If you have any feedback about how we could communicate this better, let me know, and then to go ahead and send out that email on Thursday. That usually makes people feel like they're in the loop in terms of supervising their staff, but again, going directly to individual staff is really important. I've also found that particularly for frontline staff who feel like they don't know what's going on, having someone communicate with them directly helps to improve their sense of relatedness to the organization. So that's a really powerful tool, the all staff email blast, or copies of something in everybody's box, or attending a staff meeting and letting people ask you questions directly. Super powerful. Next, ask for feedback and acknowledge it. So as I said, almost every email that I send to all staff about changes says, questions, comments, let me know. And I really do mean that. I really want people to provide me with that feedback, because a lot of times folks are going to come up with concerns or issues that I haven't been able to predict. The important piece is the acknowledgement of it. And there are sort of two levels of that acknowledgement. The first level is that when someone gives you feedback, let them know that you received it and thank them for it. You know, even if it's something that's a criticism or that maybe throws a big, huge monkey wrench into things, to say, you know, thanks for taking a moment to give me that feedback. You know, I'm going to have to think about that more, or, you know, that's something we thought about already, or let me get back to you on that. Providing that personal acknowledgement is really important. The other level of acknowledgement, though, is to kind of acknowledge that feedback to everybody who's involved. So what I've often done is, in that kind of regularly scheduled email, is to every so often take a point of feedback that has come in more than once and say, you know, we've heard from a number of you that you have concerns about whether this particular feature is going to be here. I looked it up, and sure enough, it is going to be there, and we'll send you instructions for it. Again, that gives the person who expressed that concern to you faith that you've actually listened to them and that you take their concerns seriously, which produces the effect of having more people give you more feedback, which is really an important and necessary part of a successful change initiative. You'll get flooded with feedback, and that's okay. And it really doesn't take a whole big, huge, long paragraph to answer. It can just be like, thanks so much for that. I appreciate it. And that alone, that recognition, is really powerful. So the question was asked about what if people come up with concerns or issues that you hadn't considered, and that's going to happen a lot. Even if you've got a really good team that has broad experience and is great at brainstorming, there's always going to be something that you overlook that someone who's affected by the change is going to bring to your attention. So what happens when you don't know the answer to that concern, or you can't come up with something to give that person right away to satisfy whatever concern it is that they have? You say, I don't know. This is something that I think librarians and library staff tend to be a little bit better at than in some other fields, because there's a lot of stuff that people ask us about that we don't know, and our job is to find out. So being able to say, you know, I'm not sure, let's look it up and see if we can find out, that kind of comes as second nature to us. But it can still be, especially if you're in a position of authority or leadership, it can still be kind of disconcerting to say, I don't know something to someone who's working for you or a team member, and that's okay. It's okay to feel that sort of punch in the gut of, God, am I actually admitting that I don't know the answer to something? Yes, absolutely you are. And there are several reasons for that. The first one is about honesty and authenticity. If you are honest with the people who you're working with, that there's something that you don't know the answer to, they're much more likely to take seriously the things that you do know. Or when you look it up and get back to them, that becomes a lot more meaningful than if you just kind of said, yeah, I know the answer to that, and I'll answer you in a couple days once I have a chance to think about it, and then come back. To say, you know, I don't know, but I'm going to look into it, that really is pretty powerful. Saying I don't know also gives you the opportunity to sort of model optimism in the face of uncertainty. Change comes with uncertainty built in. It's an inherent part of the process, and there will always be things that you don't know how they'll work out until you get to that point. So being able to say, you know, I don't know, but it's going to be okay, and we're going to figure it out, provides kind of a sense of comfort for some folks for whom certainty is an issue. The other thing that can help with folks who have certainty as sort of their trouble spot is to be really deliberate about documenting whatever that concern might be. So to say, you know, I don't know, but I'm going to make a note of what you've brought up, and if I lose track of it, I want you to make sure that you remind me about it so that I get back to you about it. In other words, the fact that this is something that's important to you has automatically made it something that's important to me, because I know that if I don't address it for you, then you're not going to be able to fully invest yourself in whatever this change is happening, because you're going to be worried or concerned, or you're going to have that emotional reaction that's going to get in the way. Whoops, sorry. Okay. So that's kind of my spiel. So I gave you some background about why people's reactions often are what they are, and some strategies for dealing with those reactions, including figuring out what the potential pitfalls are, planning out how you're going to communicate and making sure to drop in responses to those concerns as you go, communicating across multiple modes, giving people tiered levels of detail and letting them choose which things that are important to them, communicating directly with folks, asking for and acknowledging feedback, and then being able to say you don't know, and to have that be actually a really powerful thing as part of the change process. So, more questions?
Yes, we have had several questions, Lynn.
Great.
First one, what do you do if you cannot meet with all staff at the same time for a face-to-face communication? Would you have separate meetings, or do you have any other suggestions?
Yeah, so I've tried a bunch of different things, and it really depends on the culture of your organization and what people are comfortable with. Actually, before I answer this, I'm going to jump ahead just to the next slide, which has some resources and my contact information, so that that's there in case anyone has any questions. I'll also mention before answering this question that the second handout is kind of an overview that hits the high points of the presentation here, so it's kind of the cheat sheet version. But back to the question. So definitely multiple meetings is great. So one thing that I found very successful, particularly in a smaller work unit or a smaller library where you're never going to have everybody in the same room at the same time because you have to cover the building, is to regularly schedule multiple meetings. So to have maybe one meeting in the morning before opening so that the folks who are the morning crew can make that meeting, and then another meeting maybe the next day mid-afternoon to try to hit everybody else at that location. And that seems to work pretty well. Not everyone's going to hear exactly the same thing, of course, because the questions and concerns are going to be different. But to follow up then and say, so here are all of the concerns that I heard, and these are the ones I have an answer to, and these are the ones we're working on, then that way everybody gets the benefit of all of that information. I've also become more and more a fan of tools like Google Hangouts. Google Hangouts has some limitations to how many people can participate unless your organization is a Google for Work organization, in which case the whole organization can attend a Hangout, which means that, again, you can schedule them in a library system like mine that has 10 locations that are scattered throughout the county. We can set up like 3 or 4 times for Hangouts, and anybody can just log into them depending on schedules, and it helps to kind of do a sweep of folks who maybe you won't be able to see face to face. If you've got a webcam and you aren't self-conscious, you can at least broadcast yourself so that people can see your body language as you're talking about the change or whatever it is that's going on. And webcams are pretty cheap these days, so putting one in each remote location so that you can see that body language as well can be really useful. It can be very time-consuming to put in that FaceTime with groups of staff, but it pays dividends down the road. And if you do it successfully once and you kind of buy that goodwill from a group of staff, then you might not have to see every person face to face when the next change comes around, because they know that you're invested and that you really mean what you say and that you're going to follow through on stuff. They may not feel like they need to be in front of you to ask that question. They may feel more comfortable sending it by email.
Great, thanks, Lynn. The next question, this person likes the idea of the multiple channel message distribution, but asks, what if you have a small staff? Is it worth it to develop multiple channels for 15 employees?
That's a good question.
And then there's a second part to the question, but go ahead and answer that first.
So for that part of the question, I would say when you're working in a smaller library, you have the benefit of knowing the folks who are involved a lot more intimately than in a large library system like mine, where we have almost 300 staff members. I couldn't possibly know everybody at my library, so hitting all of those channels is much more important for me. For you, since you may know the people who are going to be involved a lot more closely, you may already know what their preferred modes of communication are. So you may know, like if you've got a bunch of text heads, that you could send an email and everybody would read it and comprehend it and be able to answer comprehension questions about it afterwards, and you might not need another form. You might also know that you've got one person who really just is not a text person. They're a visual image person, and in that case, it might be in your best interest to produce a different version of that same communication that addresses their need, depending on how critical that communication is or how critical that point in the change process might be. I think that the key in a smaller organization is just making sure that you're providing a way for everybody to gather or to consume the information that you're providing well. So you may not need to blanket all modes of communication, but you want to make sure that you're giving each person the best possible opportunity to hear what you're saying.
Okay, great, thanks. The second part of that question was, do you have any strategies for maintaining a consistent message? If you're developing multiple channels, you know, and people start to rely on a certain channel, you know, how do you make sure that you're being consistent among all your messages and all your channels?
Yeah. So I would say that that's part of that planning process. And it can be little things too, like making sure that you're using the same terminology across all of those channels. So for instance, at a previous library, we did a self-check implementation. And what we decided was that we didn't want to call it self-check because we felt like our customers would feel like either we're foisting off our work onto them, which they might not find palatable, or that they're just hung out in the wilderness on their own and that we wouldn't help them. So we decided to just call it checkout. It's the checkout machine or the checkout station. So we really made sure that in print and in a screencast that we always referred to it that way, which kind of helps to cement the continuity of that, that discussion. But the other thing is, in that plan for what you want to communicate, you may go to the level of detail of saying, okay, so in my training email, I want to make sure that people know these things. One, training is going to be plentiful and it's going to come early. Two, it's going to come in lots of different formats, so they'll be able to find something that works for them. And three, if they still need help, there's someone there. So you would make sure then that you hit those high notes on the email and the screencast and the Google Hangout and whatever other mechanisms you use for providing that communication.
Great. I still have a few more questions.
Sure.
It's 3 o'clock, so we still have some time. If anyone has other questions, please feel free to submit those. The next one is, what about that one staff person that questions everything? You know, they say you don't really want to ask for questions and concerns because you know they will always have them, even over very small things.
Yes, yes. And I will say, in libraries, we're really, really good at finding every possible contingency and variation of what might happen. So I have kind of two answers to that. One answer is to make that person your friend. So you've got somebody who provides you with a certain skill, and that is to kind of do some scenarioing in their head and pull out all kinds of details that you might not hit. In the midst of that, there's going to be stuff that I'm sure you're like, dude, seriously, that's what you're concerned about? It's really going to be okay. But the nuggets that may come with that are things that may not have crossed your mind and that may really be kind of pivot points for whether that change is going to be successful or not. So I would invite you to be as generous as possible in accepting the feedback that you get from that person. The other thing is, if you know that's going to come in a certain way from folks, you can structure the way you ask for feedback. So my general sort of questions, comments, let me know, that's really wide open. If you know that you're going to get a litany of stuff that maybe isn't going to be as useful to you as certain kinds of answers to questions, then ask specific questions. So you might say, so I'd like your feedback, and here's what I want to know. I want to know what 3 things are you most concerned about in transferring your email. Put some limits on it in terms of number, or say, you know, let's assume that we're going to be able to take care of this aspect of this change. What's the next most important thing to you? So providing those kinds of boundaries around what you're asking for can help rein in some of the out-of-control yeah buts and what abouts and what ifs and that kind of stuff. And yeah, we've got them in spades, but I really do feel like that's, as annoying as it can be, there's often some real gems among that, and it's worth listening to.
A follow-up comment came up saying that they would ask for advice, and advice is in quotes, before they did any communication to the group.
Gotcha.
So,
gotcha.
So
yeah.
Thought I'd share that.
Yeah.
And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, how do you deal with staff who are not engaging with the change? You know, maybe they're not asking any questions at all or expressing any concern.
Mm-hmm. So 2 things. I think those are actually 2 separate questions. One is people who aren't expressing concerns or who aren't asking questions aren't necessarily disengaged with the change process. It could be that you're doing such an awesome job of communicating that you're hitting those concerns before they have the chance to raise them. Or it could be that their trigger point on those SCARF domains is just a lot higher than it is for other folks. So for instance, for me, certainty it's pretty hard to trigger me on certainty. I can deal with quite a lot. So I'm not going to ask those questions that are on the what if and what about spectrum, because that really isn't where I live. It may just be that you've got staff who are like, yeah, okay, I can totally handle this and everything's going to be fine. There are, however, probably going to be folks who are disengaged from the change process. And there are a couple of ways to get at those folks. One is to talk to the supervisors or managers or influencers on your staff to say, you know, so how are things going? Is everybody kind of feeling like they know what's going on? You may get sort of a back channel question that way from someone who might not feel comfortable asking that of you directly. I actually am very lucky to have as one of my staff members the person at my organization who everybody gripes to. So she's the person who, after I go to a meeting and say, any questions, and everyone's like smiling and happy and yay, everything's fine, she's the one who will come to me 2 days later and say, you know, this person asked me about this thing. And that tells me, okay, so there's a concern out there that for whatever reason I haven't laid enough groundwork yet for them to feel comfortable bringing that to me, but I have someone that person brings it to. So try to plug into the people who are the listeners or the people who other folks tell things to. It can also come down to being a performance issue, frankly. I mean, if someone's not engaged with whatever change it is that you're going on because they're not reading their email, or they're not viewing the video, or they're not attending the meeting, that may be, depending on the kind of the stakes involved in that change, that may be something that you want to address as that person's supervisor, or to address with that person's supervisor to say, you know, this is really important. We've told you it's really important. I need you to do X, Y, and Z, and if you don't, that's something that might come up in a performance improvement plan or on a performance evaluation.
Okay, great. I've got 2 more questions.
Great.
So the next one says, sometimes decision makers are not being honest about why changes are taking place. So this person finds it difficult to motivate staff to accept the change. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, that's a really frustrating place to be. My instinct personally is always to be honest as early as possible with folks. And so it's confounding to me sometimes to run into that kind of alternate approach of keeping your cards close to the vest, or not kind of doing full disclosure on what the reasons might be. So on the one hand, if you're in the middle management layer and your administration is saying, here's this thing we're going to do, and we all know that the reason we're doing it is because of this, but we don't want to tell anybody that, that may be for you kind of a fundamental alignment question. Like, you know, is this a culture that really is the place for me to work? That's a big, huge issue that could be a whole webinar all on itself. More practically speaking, I would, and this is something that you really have to gauge within the context of your own organization. I would maybe test the waters a little bit and propose, you know, so I know you don't want to talk about this, but when people ask me this question, I want to be able to give them a decent answer. So here are a couple of possibilities that I was thinking about. I could tell them, you know, we're moving the workroom around because we need, I don't even know, like we need to do the HVAC, and so we need to get desks out from under places, when really the reason is you need to separate 2 troublemakers. You're not going to share that with staff. But you might kind of find an intermediate way to do it. So maybe, you know, it's providing working conditions that are better for everybody, or whatever, and test that out with your administration and see if that's something that would be palatable to them. Yeah, that's just a really, really tough place to be. What I would caution against is throwing your administration under the bus. It's really easy to say, yeah, I don't know why we're doing this thing this way, but they said, with a capital T, they, that we have to do this. And that undermines you in a couple different ways. It undermines you with your administration because, you know, you're not supporting whatever it is that they're working on, but it also ultimately undermines you with your staff because you've kind of given away your agency. So in that kind of situation, I might be more inclined to say, you know, the reasons for this change may not be anything that I can share with you. That, you know, we've talked about it at the administrative level, and this is something that's been decided, but I think it's important that we support this change, and here are the reasons I think that's important, and here's what we're going to do to try to make it work as best as we can.
All right, thank you. That's a good point. The last question is, we are in constant change.
Yes, we are.
You know, so how do these concepts apply, or how do you manage this constant state of change that many of our libraries are experiencing?
Yeah. It's funny. So I'm sitting here in my office, and I have a big, huge whiteboard that I've got kind of a timeline on with the different projects that I have going on, and there are, let's see, 8 of them between now and next year at this time. So I totally get it. So this is where kind of bringing the stakes into focus is really helpful. The Google for Work transition that we went through here at my library, that was high stakes. It covered the entire organization. Email is one of the key ways that we communicate, and so if that fell flat on its face, we were going to have a real problem. So those stakes were really high, so we needed to be that much more deliberate about how we rolled things out. On the flip side, we're going to do a different way of managing museum passes at my library, and the tool that we're moving to is functionally enough like what we had been using and better enough that we feel pretty comfortable saying, hey, we're going to change this thing and it's all going to be great, and that people will buy that and it'll be fine. So figuring out kind of where on the continuum the stakes lie for that change can guide how much intensity you need to bring to the table when it comes to predicting what people's responses are going to be and coming up with a plan to communicate through those responses. The other thing that I would say, this is a constant question. As you establish wins for yourself as a leader of change, as things go smoothly, as they work the way you've said that they're going to work, as you answer people's questions and address their concerns in a really honest way, that trust level is going to increase between you and your stakeholders. As that happens, it becomes easier and easier to roll out change and to take some it kind of lowers the stakes inherently in that whole process. So if people really trust that you're going to follow through and do what you say you're going to do, then you don't have to repeat it as often because you don't have to sell folks on that. So finding ways to get small wins, whether that's through a kind of small change initiative or incrementally as part of something bigger, that's kind of trust you can put in the bank so that when that kind of constant flow of change keeps chugging along, some of it can happen in a little bit more automatic a way because you've banked that trust on the front end.
Right. Well, great. That's all the questions that I have. Thank you so much, Lynn, for your time today.
My pleasure.
And giving us all some advice on communicating during times of change. I really appreciate it. I want to mention to everyone that Lynn will be returning next month on Tuesday, June 14th with another webinar called Leading Tough Conversations. So, you know, Lynn and I were talking that these two tend to complement each other. So, I don't know if you wanted to mention anything about your webinar, Lynn, for next month.
I do think that they complement each other quite well, and it's again about managing kind of emotion and and some strategies for facilitating face-to-face conversations when the emotions are running high.
Great. So again, that's Tuesday, June 14th at 2 o'clock. That's also a webinar. It is up and open on L2, but we'll make an official announcement about it in next week's Rails e-news that comes out. So thank you all for joining us today. And Lynn, thank you again, and we'll see you next month.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.